A stormy night in the west, where the wind can blow away a roof. A lonely cowboy hears a cry mixed with the thunder. A woman, holding 2 children, shivering in the dark. A cry for help. A decision made in seconds: continue as usual, or turn back. Face the pain of strangers. If it were you, in the middle of that dark night, would you have the courage to stop by a broken soul? In that storm, Jonas Hale had no idea that his choice would change the rest of his life, not only saving that woman, but also inadvertently saving his own heart that seemed to have turned to stone. Can a cry open up a new life? Can the warmth between 2 people who thought they had lost all faith rekindle hope? Let's step into the story, to see what strange things happen when 2 broken hearts find light amidst the storm. If you love heartwarming stories, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next heartwarming journeys. The night wind in Red Willow Basin has a way of telling stories. It whistles through the old pines as if whispering something from years gone by. That night, the whistle was more than just the cold air curling on the ground. It carried the smell of storms, of earth rising from dry cracks, and of a loneliness that only those who have lived long enough in the American West can understand. Jonas Hale pulled up the collar of his leather jacket and dug his boot heels into the flanks of the dark brown horse. He had lived almost 50 years, and nearly half of that had been spent riding in storms like this. He knew the wind was shifting. He knew thunder would roll down Pine Mesa Ridge in minutes, and he knew his cattle would be in trouble if he didn't check on them. The distance from Hale Cabin to the north pasture was only 2 miles, but with the wind blowing so hard it seemed to throw both man and horse from the saddle. It was not short. Jonas cowered against the cold gusts that whipped his face. His breath turned into white wisps that dissipated before it could be far. Lightning split the sky. Thunder roared like the roar of the earth. The horse threw its head back and stopped. Jonas narrowed his eyes and reached out to stroke its mane. "Okay, let's keep going." He spoke softly. His voice was hoarse, deep, and somewhat tired, but as sure as the way he had survived so many winters in this land. The worrying thing was that since this afternoon there had been signs of a calf straying from the herd. On Dry Creek Road, a stray of only a few hundred feet could lead to a rocky gorge. Jonas did not want that to happen again. He had lost too many already. As the horse approached the Northwind Trail, Jonas heard it. At first, it was only a faint sound, like wind passing over a stream. Jonas pulled back on the reins and cocked his ear. The wind whistled past, bending the short grass beside the road. Then he heard it again, a sound so small it was half sob, half plea, muffled by the wind. A cry. Jonas tightened the reins. The horse spun around, its forefeet pounding the soft, dry earth. The wind whipped against his face. The cry faded and appeared, carried by each shifting gust. It didn't sound like a cry for help. It didn't sound like a child crying out in fear. It was the cry of someone who had been silent for so long, but the storm had broken that silence. Jonas slowly turned his horse toward the sound. He strained his eyes to see through the light rain, past the broken pines, the trees swaying under the weight of the wind. Jonas's heart beat slowly but strongly, as if warning him that he was about to step into something his life had been trying to avoid. The crying became clearer as the lightning flashed a second time. Jonas saw a shadowy figure at the foot of a jagged rock about 50 feet away. A small, huddled figure, holding something to its chest. He jumped off his horse, his boots making a heavy sound on the wet ground. The wind billowed his cloak. Jonas cocked his head, trying to find his way through the thick, wind-whipped bushes. "Is anyone there?" he called out, but his voice was torn away by the wind before it could travel far. The figure turned around, startled, hugging the thing in its arms tighter. Under the flash of lightning once more, Jonas saw clearly that it was a woman. Her hair was disheveled and wet, tangled in her face. She was using her whole body to shield the very small child. Jonas walked quickly toward them. There was no need to think, only the protective instincts that were pounding like hammers in his chest. As he approached, the woman looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling as if she were about to cry. Don't come any closer," she said hoarsely, but so weakly that it was almost inaudible. Jonas stopped a few feet away from her. He raised his hands, slowly, to show that he was not a threat. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and clear, "but you can't stay out here. The storm isn't going to be easy." The child in her arms stirred slightly, making a hoarse, cold sob. Jonas bent down to look more closely. He was about 4 or 5 years old, his face flushed from the wind and the cold. The woman held the boy close to her chest, as if Jonas were a wolf stalking its prey. But in her eyes, behind the sheer fear, Jonas saw something else, the desperation of someone with nowhere else to go. Jonas took a step back, keeping his hand raised. "Listen to me," he said slowly, word by word. "If you and the boy stay out here for another 10 minutes, the cold wind will—" He hesitated for a second, not wanting to say the word death, "be very dangerous." A slight movement from the boy made the woman stop. The boy was shaking. His breathing was ragged as if he had only a little strength left. Jonas lowered his voice. "Let me hold the boy, or let me help you. We have to get out of here." At that moment, another clap of thunder tore across the sky, and a blinding white light illuminated the woman's face. She closed her eyes in fear, and when she opened them again, Jonas saw that a tiny crack had appeared in the defenses of her eyes. He stepped closer, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Her shoulder was cold as ice and trembling. "Trust me," he said, almost in a whisper. "Just this once. We have to go now." She looked at him for several long seconds. Then she nodded suddenly, very slightly. Jonas bent down at once and took the boy into his arms. The small body was lighter than he had expected, colder than he could bear. The woman tried to stand, but her legs gave way immediately. "Lean on me," Jonas said. He wrapped his arms around her waist and steadied her. Her body felt like a wet coat stuck to her bones. She leaned against him, breathing heavily. The three of them groped their way back the way he had come. The horse neighed loudly as Jonas approached with the child in his arms. Jonas placed the boy on the saddle first, then helped the woman up behind him. Finally, he took the reins and climbed up behind her, holding the boy with one arm and holding the reins with the other. The wind was so strong it threatened to knock them off their feet, but Jonas urged his horse back toward Hale cabin. The baby's faint cry rang out, then faded into Jonas's coat. And amid the howling wind, Jonas couldn't help but realize this tonight. Red Willow Basin wasn't just stormy in the sky. There was another storm brewing in his own heart. Hale cabin emerged from the darkness, a dark mass of wood clinging to the slope of Red Willow Basin. The light from the porch oil lamp flickered in the gusts of wind, making the cabin look like a small flame struggling to cope with the storm. Jonas Hale nudged the reins, trying to keep the horse going straight. As the wind grew stronger, the woman in his arms was shaking violently. Jonas could feel each shudder through her coat, like gentle waves crashing against a rocky shore. The boy in his arms was no better, his hot breath occasionally fanning over the palm of his hand, so faint that it made him purse his lips. "Hold on a little longer," Jonas said softly, as if talking to all three people on horseback, including himself. When the horse stopped in front of the cabin, Jonas jumped down first and caught the boy and the woman in his arms. As soon as she touched the ground, she collapsed. If Jonas had not caught her, she would have collapsed in the muddy snow. He guided her into the cabin. The wooden door opened, and the warm smell of ash and burning pine filled the air immediately, wrapping them like a thick blanket. Inside was only a small room with a cast-iron stove in the left corner, an old oak table and 2 chairs, a few wooden shelves for dry goods, and Jonas's single bed against the wall. Everything was simple and rough like him, but the place was warmer than anything the woman could have found in the storm. Jonas laid the boy down on the thick blanket next to the stove. The child was still curled up, its small hands clutching Jonas's collar even after Jonas had let go. Jonas looked at it for a few seconds, his eyes filled with an unconcealable sadness. "We need to dry the boy first," Jonas said to the woman. She leaned against the edge of the table, her face pale but her eyes still fixed on her son. She was breathing heavily from exhaustion and fear. I can do it," she said softly, but her cold hands were shaking so much that she couldn't unbutton the boy's shirt. Jonas approached, pausing for a moment to ask with his eyes. She nodded slightly. He carefully removed Benji's wet jacket, then wrapped another blanket around the boy. He still said nothing, only tilted his head slightly against Jonas as if feeling safe in the man's warmth. The woman followed each movement, her eyes gradually softening, but still maintaining a bit of vigilance as if it was ingrained instinct. Jonas put the kettle on the stove and added wood. The fire flared up, glowing red and then spreading a warm, yellow light. He carefully spread another blanket on the floor and motioned for her to sit down. "You need to rest. That wind is not gentle." The woman shook her head. "No, I have to. I need to see him." Jonas sat down next to the boy, checked his forehead, then looked down at the woman. "The boy will be fine. He's just cold. But you're exhausted. A cup of hot water would help." Jonas's voice carried no force. It had the surety, the calm of someone who had weathered many storms, both natural and internal. The woman looked at him for a few seconds, then sat back on the blanket. Her thin, wet robe clung to her skin, the cold still clinging to her skin. Jonas handed her a cup of hot water, steam rising from it. She held it with both hands, as if afraid of spilling it, but her hands were shaking too much. After a while, she took a very small sip. The hot water slid down her dry throat, making her shiver, the warmth slowly seeping into every cell. Jonas sat down opposite, a few feet away, to keep a safe distance. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the cabin, there was only the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of 3 people. "What is your name?" Jonas asked, still keeping his voice low, as if speaking even a little louder would cause the woman to jump in panic. She looked at him. The firelight on her pale face made her eyes seem several years older. "Mara," she replied, her voice so low that if the cabin hadn't been dead silent, Jonas wouldn't have heard. He nodded slightly. "What about the boy Benji? Benji Ellery?" Jonas looked at the child, who was sleeping fitfully. The boy's name, in the woman's weary voice, sounded like a prayer. A gust of wind hit the window, startling Mara, who clutched the cup in her hand. Jonas leaned toward her a little, as if to reassure her that the other door wouldn't blow open. "This storm will last for a few more hours," said Jonas. "You 2 stay here until morning." Mara bowed her head. She tried to say thank you, but her voice caught. Jonas saw it, so he didn't wait for her to speak. Instead, he stood up, took a dry towel, and gave it to her. "You wipe yourself off. Then I'll light another fire." She took the handkerchief, her hands still shaking, but this time there was no fear in her eyes. There was something else, a little gratitude, a little confusion, a little like she wanted to believe this stranger, but didn't dare to completely. Jonas returned to the stove and added more wood. The fire blazed, filling the room with light. After a moment, Mara spoke softly. You didn't ask why we were out there." Jonas paused for a moment. Then he spoke, still not turning around. "Heaven and earth have asked you. Now I don't need to ask any more. That made Mara look at him longer. No one had spoken to her that way in a long time. No one had looked at her like a person trying to survive, rather than someone who had to explain. By the stove, little Benji stirred. Jonas returned immediately, coming closer to see if he needed more blankets. He put a reassuring hand on his small shoulder. The boy closed his eyes. His breathing evened. Mara looked at the scene, her eyes slowly softening like ice melting in the first sunlight after a long winter. She wondered silently if the man had ever had a child. The way he carried Benji out of the storm, the way he touched him, the way he lowered his voice as if afraid to startle the child, all said he had lost something that was still in his heart. She didn't dare ask. Jonas wasn't the type to confide, and she wasn't sure she could handle it right now. The storm outside was howling as if it would tear the hill apart, but inside the cabin the fire still burned, and more than that, it radiated a gentle warmth. Something Jonas and Mara had long forgotten the feeling of: faith. Even if it is just a small faith, fragile like an oil lamp flickering in the wind. But sometimes, just a small light is enough to guide the way through a long, stormy night. Dawn in Red Willow Basin was often slower than elsewhere, not because the sun was lazy, but because the pine hills of Pine Mesa Ridge stood like old sentinels, blocking out the first light of day. That morning, as the first light crept through the wooden walls of Hale cabin, Jonas Hale woke before the sun. He sat up quietly, keeping his movements small so as not to wake Mara and Benji. The stove still glowed with last night's embers. Jonas stood, slung his thick coat over his shoulders, walked quietly to the cabin door, and opened it slightly. Cold air rushed in, sharp and fresh as the surface of a spring in the morning. The wind has died down. The storm has passed. He took a deep breath. The smell of rain-soaked earth was the one thing that always made him feel alive, though sometimes he wasn't sure if that mattered. Behind him, Mara's small, tired voice rang out. "You get up early." Jonas turned. Mara was sitting against the wall, a blanket wrapped around her. The morning light caught her tangled hair, making her look both vulnerable and with a certain tenacity that was ingrained in her features. "I'm used to it," said Jonas. "People who live alone usually don't sleep more than twice a night." Mara nodded slightly. She looked down at Benji, sleeping soundly under the covers, his breathing more even than last night. His cheeks were rosy from the night's warmth. "Last night. Thank you," she said softly. "If it weren't for you, we would have—" Her voice choked. Jonas did not let her finish the sentence. "No need to say anything," he replied. "Just consider it as what everyone else should do." Mara looked at him a beat longer. There was something in that look that wasn't immediate trust, but the beginning of it. Jonas returned to the kitchen and rekindled the fire. He filled the cast-iron pot with water and prepared breakfast. The soft sputter of steam filled the quiet cabin. Mara stood up and walked slowly to the stove. "I want to help," she whispered. "I owe you so much." Jonas shook his head. "You're still weak. Just sit down." But Mara refused to sit. She took a clean, folded towel from the shelf and gently wiped the mist from the window. It was a small gesture, but it meant something in a cabin that had been without a woman for years. "It looks lonely here," Mara said, still facing the window. "I assume you live alone." Jonas paused. The question was not impolite. It was just, he was not used to answering it. "Yes," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. 3 years. Mara did not turn around, but Jonas knew she heard. He continued speaking, in a flatter voice, as if telling someone else's story. "I have a wife and a son. He's the same age as Benji. When—" He paused. "When the landslide happened at Eagle Step Bluff," Mara turned to look at him, Her face showed sympathetic pain, real and gentle, like someone's hand on an old wound, not to make it hurt more, just to say they saw it. Jonas put down the wooden ladle and took a deep breath. After that day, I couldn't be near anyone anymore. Every noise in the night made me think I was going to lose someone again, so I lived here, as far away as possible. Mara said nothing more. She just pulled a chair closer to the stove and sat down across from him. "I'm sorry," she said. Not an empty apology, but the apology of someone who knows what loss feels like. After a while, Benji began to stir. He rubbed his head against the blanket and opened his eyes. The warmth still clung to his cheeks, and his round eyes looked around, bewildered. Mara immediately came to his side. "Benji," she called softly. "Are you okay?" Benji didn't answer right away. He turned to look at Jonas. When their eyes met, Benji didn't flinch away like he had last night. He just stared for a long time, trying to figure out if the man was a threat or not. Then he whispered hoarsely, louder than the wind outside, "You won't leave me behind." Jonas was stunned. Mara was also surprised. Benji rarely opened his mouth to speak complete sentences to strangers. Jonas sat down next to the child, still keeping his voice low and soft. "No, Benji. I don't leave anyone in a storm." Benji looked at him for a few more seconds. Then he buried his face in Mara's chest, his small shoulders relaxing. A sense of security, if only a little, had reached him. Mara gently stroked the boy's back and whispered, "You see, Mr. Jonas is very nice." Jonas was silent, tilting his head to avoid the look Mara gave him when he said that. Not because he was shy, but because he felt a warm and sad feeling rising inside him. A feeling he thought he had let die with the landslide years ago. He stood up and returned to the stove, continuing to stir the corn porridge, trying to keep himself busy to hide what had just stirred in his heart. Breakfast was simple cornmeal porridge, some warm bacon, and 2 glasses of warm water. Jonas poured first for Mara, then for Benji, and last for himself. Mara noticed, and there was a strange warmth in her gaze. After a few spoonfuls, Benji looked up and whispered, "Mr. Jonas." Jonas was raising the spoon to his lips, then paused. "Yeah, Benji. Thank you for saving me." Jonas's hands trembled slightly. Mara noticed. She breathed out, as if she had just witnessed something more than a child's thank you. Jonas did not answer at once. Then he nodded slowly. "It's nothing, child." The words were simple, but Jonas's voice was hoarse. Mara knew he was trying to keep his emotions from spilling over. In the West, men didn't usually cry, but their silence sometimes spoke louder than their cries. After breakfast, Jonas took his coat outside to dry. Mara stood in the doorway watching. The morning light fell on Jonas's back, casting a long shadow on the damp ground. She suddenly said, "Last night, I was so scared I couldn't breathe. But when you held Benji, I suddenly thought, maybe you won't hurt us." Jonas stood still for a long moment before turning back. "I don't know anyone who believes me so quickly," he said. "Not so fast." Mara shook her head slightly, her voice honest. "But I don't have many options left." That made Jonas look at her longer, at her eyes that held the strength of someone exhausted but still trying to stand. He felt something vague, which he perhaps dared not name, that the appearance of this woman, with the child huddled in her arms, had stirred a part of him which he had thought dead forever. And just as Jonas was about to turn away to hide it, the distant sound of horse hooves rang out from the end of the valley, not loud, not clear, but enough to send a chill down Jonas's spine. He looked away. Mara, though not listening, sensed the tension in him. Jonas's face did not change color, but his eyes became sharper. It was no longer the peaceful dawn of a new day, but a sign of something approaching. Something Jonas wasn't sure was a storm, or something more dangerous than a storm. The sound of the horse's hooves at dawn did not recur, as if it were only an echo of the wind across Red Willow Basin. But Jonas Hale knew well in this land. Strange sounds rarely appeared without cause and then disappeared harmlessly. He stood a moment longer on the porch of Hale cabin, his gaze fixed on the end of the valley where Dry Creek Road wound like a long, dusty streak all the way to Larkspur Crossing. Jonas's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were trying to register the slightest change in the landscape. Mara Ellery, standing a little way behind him, watched. She hadn't heard the sound, but her travel-weary intuition told her Jonas was worried about something deeper than the morning wind. She stepped closer, keeping just enough distance so as not to intrude into this man's closed, private world. "Who do you think it is?" Her voice was low but steady. Jonas turned, his eyes not panicked but with the wariness familiar to those who had lived long in the West. "I am not sure," he said slowly, "but no one passes here this early in the morning without a reason." Mara was silent for a few seconds. Her hand tightened on the folds of her dress at her waist, as if to steady herself. "Maybe they're just passing by," she said. "Maybe." Jonas nodded slightly. "But I'll check the north fence and the tracks around the pines, just to be sure." He didn't say he was worried about her and Benji. Jonas wasn't the type of man to say that out loud, but the way he looked toward the cabin, then at the hill they'd passed in the storm last night, was enough for Mara to understand. After a few quick bites of hot cornflakes, Jonas pulled on his boots and leather jacket and walked out the door, carrying a rope and a long-handled axe. Mara stood in the doorway, watching him disappear behind the undergrowth. "Are you going alone?" she called after him. Jonas looked back. "Just checking around the house. It's not far." Mara nodded slightly, but her heart was troubled. Jonas saw it in her eyes, and for perhaps the first time in years, he forced a small smile. "I'm used to it." "Mara," he said softly. "This place doesn't give me any trouble." The cabin door closed behind him. Mara sighed softly. She went back inside, adjusted Benji's coat, and checked the kitchen. He was sitting in a chair near the fireplace, holding the wooden toy Jonas had given him the night before. Benji opened his round eyes and looked at her. "Where are you going?" "Mr. Jonas." His voice was small and choked with sleep. Mara stroked his hair. "He's just passing through. Don't worry." But in her own voice, the worry was not entirely hidden. Outside the cabin, the wind was still cold, but less fierce than last night. Jonas walked slowly, his heavy boots crunching in the rain-soaked dirt. The scent of pine drifted down from Pine Mesa Ridge on the gentle breeze. Jonas bent down to examine the strange footprints near the north fence. The hoof pattern was clear, not his horse's, a large, deep print, indicating that the rider had been either heavily laden or had stopped there for a while. He stood up and looked in the direction the hoof prints disappeared into the pines. Jonas's lips pressed into a straight line. Something wrong. Still, he did not panic. Jonas's fear was not the fear of an inexperienced person, but rather the silent, heavy, stone-like feeling of someone who had lost so much that his intuition became frighteningly sharp. In the cabin, Mara tried to keep her hands busy. She gathered up the damp blankets and hung them near the fireplace. She mopped up the water stains on the wooden floor. She fixed a loose nail on a chair with the small hammer Jonas had placed in the corner. Every little thing helped her keep her breathing steady, but sometimes her eyes would dart to the door, just to make sure Jonas was still there, even if he hadn't returned. Benji scribbled lines in the thin layer of dust on the table, then glanced at Mara. "Miss Mara, Mr. Jonas. Is he nice?" She stopped mid-sentence. That small question was light, but it pierced her heart in a strange way. "He," she said slowly, "is a good man. Very good." Benji nodded and continued drawing. "I see him as my father from the past." The sentence came out unconsciously, light and sad like a stretched string. Mara was startled. She knelt down and took Benji in her arms. "Benji, it's over. You're safe here." The boy nodded, but his hand still held tightly to the wood carving Jonas had given him the night before. Mara saw it, and for the first time since they had fled, she felt a soft spot inside her, a place she had not dared to touch all this time. Hope. A very small hope, but enough to make her eyes sting. Jonas returned when the sun was high above the pines. Mara saw his silhouette in the distance through the window and quickly got up to open the door. Jonas entered the cabin, shook the snow from his shoulders, and put down the axe. "What's wrong?" Mara asked as soon as he took off his gloves. Jonas thought for a second before replying, "I'm not sure, but there are strange hoof prints around the house. Someone stopped near the fence." Mara paled. "Is that—" She didn't dare say the other person's name. "I haven't confirmed it yet." Jonas shook his head. "But to be sure. From now on, you and Benji don't leave the cabin without me." Mara gripped the corner of the table. "I don't want you to get into trouble because of us." Jonas looked at her, his eyes strangely firm and gentle. "Trouble doesn't arise from nowhere, Mara. It only finds its way where there's something important to protect." Mara opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat, not from fear, but because Jonas's words touched a place she thought had frozen from all those months on the run. A thin silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy or distant. It was like damp soil after a rain warming, seeping, waiting for something to grow. Around noon, when the sun was higher, Jonas decided to show Mara some light chores around the house to help her feel less uneasy. He showed her how to start a fire without blowing smoke back into the cabin. He showed her how to sort the bundles of wood by dryness, and how to use a small knife to peel the skin of the dried yucca root to make rope. Mara was not as clumsy as he had thought. Her movements were slow and steady. Perhaps her experience as a teacher had made her naturally nimble with her hands. "Have you ever done manual work?" Jonas asked when he saw her chopping the wood into round, even pieces. "I have done everything," Mara replied, neither proud nor sad. "Life gave me no choice, so I learned to do everything." Jonas nodded slightly. "I understand." "What do you understand?" she asked softly. "The feeling of having to stand firm, even when there is nothing left to hold on to." Mara looked at him. For the first time in days on the run, she did not avoid a man's gaze. She saw in those eyes not only vigilance, but also such empathy that it made her want to lean on those shoulders for once, even though her reason told her not to. But she said nothing, and Jonas said nothing more. There was only the sound of the wind passing through the cracks in the wood of the cabin, and the steady breathing of Benji taking a nap. Around noon, Jonas went to the back of the cabin to get more water from the tank. Mara stood in the kitchen, looking out the window. The midday light illuminated Jonas's figure steady, strong, yet strangely alone. The feeling of him touching her made her shiver slightly. A man who lost everything and still stood strong like that. Perhaps he can also hold on to a storm. And then, also someone that a worn-out heart like hers could trust. But that peace did not last long. When Jonas returned, setting the pail down on the floor, he paused. On his shoes, there was a strange mud. Not cabin mud, not valley mud, a darker, sticky mud, like the mud of the land on the banks of Dry Creek Road near town. Mara followed his gaze. Her face paled instantly. Jonas looked up and said slowly, "Someone was closer than I thought." Out there, in the vast red willow basin, someone had begun to follow their footsteps. And Jonas knew to protect the two people sheltering in this small cabin, he would have to prepare sooner than he had planned. The afternoons in Red Willow Basin always have a very special light. Not too bright like the south, not too gray like the mountains far north. The light here is just gentle, warm enough to make people feel less lonely, but cold enough to remind them that winter is always lurking somewhere behind. That afternoon, the light cast a very peaceful hue over Hale Cabin, a peace so fragile that the slightest noise could shatter it into pieces. After discovering the strange layer of mud on Jonas's shoes, Mara became unusually quiet. Not the kind of silence that was avoided or the kind that was sad, but the silence of someone who was trying to keep all her emotions to herself so as not to embarrass others. Benji was still sleeping, his breathing even and soft. Jonas held his hand to his forehead for a long moment, the way a father would do every night for a child he had lost. But Jonas said nothing. He just stood there watching the boy, his eyes warm and painful, as if he were looking at something he once knew very well, but had not touched for a long time. Mara stood behind him, silently. "You worry about me a lot, don't you?" she asked softly. Jonas jerked his shoulders slightly, not in surprise, but because the question touched a part of his memory he always avoided looking directly at. "I worry about both of you," he said. "Anyone passing through this area when it's so cold is no accident." Mara clenched her hands. Roy won't stop. Her voice was weak and shaky, but sincere. He never gives up when he wants something. Jonas turned. "Don't assume the worst. But if he really wants to find me, I'll know sooner than he thinks." There was something about the way Jonas spoke that made Mara feel less afraid. Not because he promised, but because his voice had a calmness that Western men rarely used with anyone but those they wished to protect. The afternoon passed in small, peaceful moments. Things that, if not for the incident, would probably not be remembered after a long day. But for the three people staying at Hale Cabin, each moment had a special meaning. Mara made the bed, carefully adjusting the corners of the blanket. Benji woke up, eyes still sleepy, and ran to hug her legs. He didn't cry, but the hug was enough to make Mara feel that his weakness was still there, only temporarily covered by the warmth of this cabin. Jonas brought in the wood, piled it next to the stove, then turned. "Just tell me what you need. There isn't much here, but the essentials. I have them." Mara smiled faintly, but her eyes brightened as she looked at him. "Enough. Jonas. It's safe enough here." Jonas started to say something, but then he bent down to pick up the old glass and carry it to the sink, avoiding her gaze. Still, Mara saw his shoulders shift as if what she had said had slightly disturbed him, a rare thing for a man whose heart had been sealed by loss. Late in the afternoon, Jonah decided to teach Mara how to use the oil lamp hanging high above the porch. There may not be a storm tonight, but the wind is still strong. The lamp needs to be positioned so the wind won't blow it out. Mara stepped closer, her hand outstretched but quickly pulled back as the wind whipped at her. "I have never done this before." "It's okay," Jonas said softly. "Everyone starts from nowhere." He took Mara's hand and guided her to adjust the wick. His hand was large, warm, and steady. Hers was smaller, cold, and trembling slightly. When their fingertips touched, Mara instinctively withdrew her hand. "Sorry," she stammered. Jonas shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. I just forgot that not everyone is used to having people standing so close." Mara bowed her head. Her cheeks flushed despite the chilly wind. It's been a long time since someone helped me do something." The words were soft, but Jonas heard them. He did not reply verbally, but gently turned the lamp so that Mara could see better. "Okay. Try again." Mara's hand was steady this time. The flame of the oil lamp flared up, casting a golden glow on her face. The light highlighted her exhaustion, but also reflected a resilience Jonas rarely saw in someone after just one night. Night fell. The wind died down, whispering through the pines of Pine Mesa Ridge like an old Western song. Jonas sat in a rocking chair by the stove, holding a half-finished coil of twine. Mara sat beside him, mending Benji's coat. Benji sat between them, tracing the carvings on the wooden toy Jonas had made with his fingers. No one said much, but the silence itself had a strange warmth, as if the three of them were sharing a language only those who have endured loneliness can understand. After a moment, Mara looked up at Jonas. "You've been sitting here alone." "For 3 years." "Yes," Jonas replied, his eyes never leaving the rope. "There was a time when I thought I would live like this for the rest of my life." Mara put down her shirt and looked straight at him. "You don't feel sad." Jonas stopped. "The sadness is gone. When you lose everything, there isn't much sadness left. There's only habit and a void. Empty." The word echoed in Mara's mind like an echo. She understood. She had been living in her own space for over a year now. "I also thought I would have nowhere to turn," she whispered. "No one to trust. No one to rely on." Jonas's eyes lowered, listening. "But last night, when you carried Benji, and didn't let go even though my hands were shaking like they were about to fall off the horse's back, I thought, She hesitated, her eyes cast down. "Maybe there is still a place for people like us, people who have lost so much." After a long moment, Jonas answered. His voice was soft but firm. "You don't have to run anymore. Mara, at least, not now." The gentleness in Jonas's voice made Mara turn to look at him. In the reflected firelight, she saw in his eyes a sympathy so deep it made her want to cry, but she held back. Benji looked up at Jonas. "Mr. Jonas, will you stay here with us?" The question left both Mara and Jonas speechless. Jonas bent down and placed his hand on the child's shoulder. "As long as you need me, I won't go away." That's not a sweet promise. That's the word of a Western man. A man who only says what he can actually do. Mara turned away to hide her red eyes. Not because she was sad, but because it had been so long since she had heard words that made her believe in tomorrow. But right after that peaceful moment, Jonas suddenly stood up. Mara was startled. What happened? Jonas held up a hand for silence. He cocked his head, listening. The air in the cabin suddenly became as tense as a bowstring. Outside, there was the sound of dry leaves being trampled, softly. But in a remote place like Red Willow Basin, any strange noise at night could be a sign. Jonas put down the rope, walked to the door, and grabbed the shotgun hanging next to the wooden cabinet. He turned back and looked at Mara and Benji. "Keep quiet. Don't leave the stove." Mara hugged Benji. Her heart was pounding. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, peace had just reached the doorstep. Then it stood on the brink. The footsteps on the wooden steps were faint, but in the silence of Red Willow Basin at night, they sounded like metal on metal. The wind was still blowing, but it seemed to have lowered its voice to listen. Jonas Hale stood by the wooden door, shotgun in hand. Not because he wanted to shoot, but because he had learned too well that preparation always saves lives. He tilted his head, his eyes fixed on the two small figures behind him where Mara Ellery held Benji close, their breaths mingling with the crackling fire. "Mara," Jonas said very softly. "Keep quiet." Mara nodded. She pulled Benji close to her chest, her eyes wide, staring at Jonas's back. In that moment, she realized she was no longer shaking. Not because she was any less afraid, but because the man before her had unconsciously become a wall she could trust. Jonas reached out and touched the latch lightly. He didn't turn it right away. He waited. The footsteps came again, this time clearer. Someone was coming around to the right of the cabin, which was next to the old, long-disused stables. Jonas crouched lower, avoiding the view from the small window on the left. He gestured with his hand for Mara to bend down. She did so immediately. The footsteps stopped. A cold wind blew through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it the sound of dry branches rubbing against each other. But Jonas knew the sound was not from the wind. Through the narrow window he saw a dark figure standing still, slightly tilted, as if observing the cabin. Not tall, not big, just standing and looking. Jonas held his breath for several endless seconds. Mara knelt behind him, one hand covering Benji's eyes so he wouldn't see the scene at the door. Finally, Jonas decided. He unlocked the door, but opened it very slowly, without making a loud noise, and opened the door just enough to peek out. "What's wrong?" Jonas Mara exclaimed in her head, but didn't dare say it out loud. The faint moonlight illuminated the yard in front of the cabin, revealing the person standing there. A boy, not much older than Benji, about 7 or 8. Torn jacket, disheveled hair, dust on his face. Jonas opened the door a little wider, gun still lowered but ready. "What are you doing here?" Jonas asked, his voice low but not threatening. The boy took a step back, his eyes frightened but resilient, the kind of resilience that only comes from children who have lived too early with the things adults experience. The boy swallowed. "I'm looking for my mother." Jonas frowned. "Looking for Mom. Here." The boy nodded. "The blacksmith at Larkspur Crossing said there was a woman walking down the trail last night who looked like my mother. I followed the trail. I think she's here. In the rear cabin." Mara heard every word. She trembled, but not with fear. She shook her head repeatedly, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jonas stood in the doorway, blocking the boy from looking in. "What is your name?" "Evan." "Evan Dolan." The name was enough to make Jonas squint. Dolan. That was an unusual name. In these parts, anyone who mentioned Roy Dolan was treated with caution. "Who is your father?" Jonas asked bluntly. The boy bent down, wringing his hands together. My father is Roy Dolan." Mara's heart stopped beating. Benji didn't understand, but seeing her shiver, he clutched her sleeve. Jonas kept his face impassive, but the veins in his hands tightened. This boy was Roy Dolan's son, the man Mara had always feared, the man who had made her run away in the middle of a storm. He was Evan's father. The truth burst out of the darkness, exposing everything Mara tried to hide. Jonas did not open the door further. "Does your father know you are here?" Evan shook his head vigorously. "No. My father left early. I ran away with a man looking for a horse. Then I ran here because someone said they saw someone who looked like my mother." The boy's voice cracked. "I just want to know if my mother is still alive." Jonas turned his head to look at Mara. She froze. Her eyes were filled with panic. But Jonas saw something deeper in them, the pain of a mother who knew her child was standing outside the door. The child of the man she was running from. Mara shook her head slightly, her eyes filling with tears. "No, it can't be. Evan." Benji looked at her, then looked out the door. His eyes filled with confusion. Jonas turned back and said to the boy, "You're cold. Come in here. Wait." Mara stood up, her voice trembling. "Jonas." "No. This boy is not at fault," Jonas replied softly, but firmly. no matter who his father is. Mara clenched her hands until they turned white, but said nothing more. She gasped, like someone preparing to face the second storm of her life. Jonas led the boy into the cabin. Evan had just stepped through the doorway when he saw Mara. Both stood still as if petrified. Mara put her hand to her mouth. "Evan! Oh my God!" Evan blinked repeatedly, then whispered, "Mom! Is that you?" The boy's voice was choked, hopeful yet still apprehensive, as if he was afraid that if he believed in something too soon, it would vanish. Mara fell to her knees, her arms outstretched, trembling. "Evan, how did you get here?" Evan ran to hug her. He buried his head in her chest and sobbed, not because he was afraid, but because he had finally found a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. Mara hugged the boy tightly, tears falling into his hair. "Evan, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Jonas watched the scene in silence. A warm and heavy feeling rose in his heart, warm because this boy, though he came from a dangerous place, was just a child who needed a mother. Heavy because the appearance of Evan Dolan meant that Roy Dolan might arrive sooner than expected. Benji watched Evan hug his mother, his eyes hesitant. He sat closer to Jonas and asked softly, "So, Evan is—" Your brother Jonas reached up and stroked Benji's hair. It was not an easy question. He looked at Mara for a long moment, then answered hesitantly, "Benji, Evan is, his half-brother." Benji looked at Evan, then back up at his mother. His eyes weren't angry, just confused. "So, you have 2 children." Mara hugged Benji to one side, Evan to the other. "Yeah, I have, you guys. I'm sorry, I didn't get to say." The 2 children hugged their mother, and Mara hugged them both, as if trying to make up for all the loss in a single embrace. Jonas turned away, not because he was upset, but because the sight struck at the old emptiness he buried deep inside. A moment later, knowing that there were 3 people in the cabin who needed him, Jonas returned, his voice low but steady. "Mara, this changes everything. If Evan runs away on his own, Roy will definitely go crazy looking for him. He will follow all the traces." Mara squeezed her 2 children. "Jonas, He held up a hand to stop them. "It's okay. I'll keep you 3 safe, but from now on, we have to be more prepared." Mara looked at him with eyes that had never been so deep. "Jonas, you didn't have to do that. I need to—" Jonas interrupted, his voice firm, "because if I leave you 3 alone, I won't be myself anymore." Evan looked up at Jonas. You will protect Mom, and us." Jonas knelt down and placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. "If need be, I will stand in front of all 3 of you. No one is to harm this family." The words made Mara gasp. She felt something flow through her chest, a strange warmth she had never believed existed. Outside, the wind whistled through Pine Mesa Ridge as if to warn of something to come. But in Hale cabin, for once, there was no fear, just a family fragile, patched together, but beginning to mend. And in the middle of that small cabin, Jonas Hale stood there, a quiet, lonely man, but gradually finding the part of his heart he thought was lost. The wind was quieter that night in Red Willow Basin than it had been the previous nights, but the silence made the air heavier. For Jonas Hale, the silence was sometimes more frightening than a storm, because the storm told people what was coming, and the silence only made people guess what was yet to be revealed. After Evan fell asleep next to Benji, the 2 children finally lying side by side, as if they had known each other for half their lives, Marcia sat silently on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the firelight without saying a word. The firelight reflected off her face, both tired and beautiful in a very human way, plain, honest, unadorned. Jonas sat at the table, wiping the shotgun clean with slow, even movements, an old habit that helped him stay alert. Occasionally he glanced at Mara, not because he expected her to say anything, but because he feared that if he didn't look, she would melt into silence, as she had melted into the night of escape. A long while passed before the first voice was heard. "Jonas," Mara said, her voice very small. Jonas put down the broom and turned. "Go ahead. Evan, is he like his father?" Her voice was almost trembling, as if she was asking the question she was most afraid of knowing the answer to. Jonas thought for a moment, then replied slowly, "No, not the same. He has Roy Dolan's shadowless eyes." Mara bowed her head, her hands clasped together. "I fear that, Jonas, that one day he will become like him, that bad blood will drag him into bad things." Jonas stood up and moved closer to her. "Mara, listen to me," he said quietly but firmly. "Blood doesn't define a person. People are raised by what they are taught, by what others do for them. Evan, he's not Roy." Mara looked up, "But I left it behind. I left it with him too long. You ran to protect Benji, and to survive. A mother who survives is better than a mother who dies at the hands of someone like Roy," Jonas said, his voice hoarse. "You're not the only one who has done something you hate to keep what's left." That made Mara stop breathing. She saw in Jonas's eyes a shadow of his past, the pain of losing his wife and child, of having to survive despite his broken heart. Only, he didn't run away. He stayed, in this cabin, accepting the solitude as his punishment. Mara looked down at the two sleeping children. "I don't know if I'm good enough for them," Jonas replied without hesitation. "You are enough. You survived. You love the children. You do not turn away from fear." He took a step forward, his voice deeper. "You are strong, Mara, stronger than you think." She laughed softly, but it was mixed with a shaky breath. "What about you? Jonas, do you think you're strong enough to carry us?" He looked at her for a long time. The firelight illuminated the lines of his face, carved by time and by a sadness strong enough to drown another man. "No," he said, startling Mara. "It's not enough alone." "But—" Jonas looked at the two children, then back at Mara, his eyes softening in the way only those who have lost so much can. "Together, we can." Mara was silent, but something was melting in that silence, the thick ice of wariness, the fear that she didn't deserve anyone's protection, the uncertainty about whether she could trust anyone again. She took a deep breath. "Thank you." Jonas nodded slightly. "You rest. I have work to do." As Mara lay down beside the children, Jonas began to prepare, not telling anyone, not worrying anyone, just quietly doing what needed to be done to keep this house standing against the storm. He took a coil of thick rope and tied the loose planks to the side of the cabin. He checked every bolt and every bolt. He sprinkled sand on the path to erase Evan's footprints as he ran. He cleaned the stove, making sure the fire wasn't too bright so as not to attract attention from a distance. He placed an axe behind the door, not for fighting, but in case he needed to break down the door and lead the three of them to the pine forest. He did everything as if he had lived his whole life waiting for this exact night. When he had finished, Jonas went out onto the porch. It was a moonless night, but there was a light from distant stars. He stood for a long time, looking down at the end of the valley. The familiar feeling returned, the feeling of a man who knew very well that peace never came without a price. In the cabin, Mara woke to the sound of a wooden door creaking. She put on her coat and opened the door. Jonas turned back, surprised. "Why aren't you sleeping?" "Can't sleep," she replied. "What are you doing?" Just getting ready, Jonas said, avoiding her eyes. Mara stepped closer to him. Jonas, you can't face Roy alone. Not a confrontation. He adjusted his cloak, which was blowing askew in the wind. I just want to see how safe I can keep you three. You don't need to stand on the front lines alone, Mara said, her voice serious. If Roy comes, I'll talk to him. Jonas turned sharply, his voice as sharp as a knife. No. Mara was stunned. Why, because I know Roy, Jonas said, his eyes darkening. I know he didn't come to talk. He came to take what he thought was his. He didn't care who got hurt. Mara held her breath. You don't understand. Roy. He used to. She paused. Jonas did not ask further. He knew that sometimes there were things one could only say when one was ready, and Mara was not ready. Not tonight. He said only one sentence, very softly. It's okay. I'm here. Those 3 simple words made Mara look up at him for a long time. In the dim light of the oil lamp, Jonas's face was a solid, strong, calm line, and there was something undeniable about his presence that made this place feel like home. For the first time in years, Mara said honestly, you make me feel safer than anywhere else I've ever been. Jonas clasped his hands together lightly to keep from showing his emotion, not because he didn't want to hear it, but because the words went to a part of him he thought was dead. He took a deep breath and nodded. Then, from now on, you can rely on me. Mara took a step back, not to avoid it, but to keep the tears from falling. She turned back inside, looking at the 2 sleeping children. And on the porch, Jonas stood for a long time, looking at the shadow of Pine Mesa Ridge and wondering if his life was strong enough to protect 3 more hearts that were placing their trust in him. But he knew the answer immediately. Yes. Because for the first time in years, he was no longer standing alone in the dark. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pines of Pine Mesa Ridge and into the small window of Hale cabin. The air was still cold, but warmer than the windy days of the past. Jonas Hale awoke early, as usual. He sat on the narrow bed, bowing his head for a long time before standing. In the cabin, Mara Ellery and the 2 children were still sleeping. Benji was curled up in his blanket, his breathing steady like the wind blowing through the meadow. Evan lay close to his mother, still clutching a corner of Mara's shirt, as if afraid that if he let go, she would disappear. Jonas stood looking at them for a moment, his eyes softening in a way he rarely let others see. The sight of a woman and 2 children lying in his house filled the small cabin with a warmth it had not felt since his wife had left. The warmth was so beautiful it hurt. Pain from the fear of loss. Pain from remembering the past, but also pain in a way that made one want to hold on to what one had with all the strength left. He turned away. He had work to do before the others woke up. Jonas opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air in Red Willow Basin smelled of earth and pine and the lingering steam of the storm. But in the air, Jonas sensed something else. Signs of human presence. He walked around to the back of the cabin, where the old porch sheltered a small corner of land. There, under the thin layer of mist, were fresh footprints. Footprints that did not belong to him, or Mara, or the children. A male footprint, wide, deep, stopping right at the corner of the wall, where the entire front door of the cabin could be seen. Jonas stood up straight, his jaw clenched. Still no sound. No horse, no man. Only this trail. A reminder that they were no longer alone in this quiet land. He bent down and touched the edge of the mark lightly. The soil was still damp, but not soft. This mark must have been made last night. Not while Jonas was awake on the porch. Not while he bolted the door for the last time. Which means someone was standing here, while everyone was sleeping. Jonas looked up toward the distant Dry Creek Road. The morning wind blew through his hair, and, in that moment, Jonas knew the name of the only person brave or arrogant enough to approach his cabin without hiding his footprints. Roy Dolan. He's coming. In the cabin. Mara woke to the soft creak of the wooden door. She jumped up faster than usual. Her reflexes were always ready to run, but when she saw Benji and Evan lying next to her, she calmed a bit. She stepped out onto the porch just as Jonas returned. He closed the door softly behind him, but Mara's eyes caught the difference in his expression. The concern was not for himself, but for the person inside this cabin. "Jonas," she asked, her voice hoarse from waking. "Is something wrong?" Jonas did not hide it. "There are strange footprints around the cabin." Mara clenched her collar, her face pale. "Who's not sure," Jonas said, "but I don't want to take it lightly." She didn't need Jonas to tell her his name, even without seeing footprints. She knew there was only one person who could have appeared in the night without making a sound. Roy Dolan. Mara staggered, and Jonas caught her. Jonas's hand was warm and firm on her elbow. "Mara, listen," he said slowly. "You and the children are safe. He just wandered around. He didn't come near the cabin, but he will come back." Mara whispered. "Maybe," Jonas replied, without beating around the bush. "But I'll be ready." Mara looked up at Jonas, and there was something in her eyes she couldn't put into words, growing faith, though she dared not admit it, and fear of losing what she had found. She took a deep breath. "Jonas, you don't need to risk it for me. Roy, he's dangerous. Not like normal people." Jonas narrowed his eyes, then said very softly, "Every man is dangerous in his own way. The difference is whether they use danger to protect or to harm." Mara stood still. The words made her heart clench and relax at the same time, like alternating hot and cold currents. The children woke up a little after sunrise. Benji rubbed his eyes. Evan sat up, still bewildered by his new surroundings. Jonas returned to the cabin just as Mara was preparing some corn porridge for the children. Benji ran to hug Jonas's leg. "Mr. Jonas, isn't it going to storm again today?" Jonas stroked the boy's tangled hair. "There's no storm. It's just wind." The words sounded calm, but Mara knew Jonas was speaking in another way. Evan stood behind, looking at Jonas with a look that was both shy and grateful. "Hello," the boy said softly. Jonas nodded. "Good morning. Evan." Jonas's gaze toward Evan was neither cold nor wary. It was the calm of someone who knew this child was caught between a fleeing mother and a pursuing father. That quietly softened Jonas. After breakfast, Jonas told his mother and children to sit near the stove and said, "I need to go to the northern woods to check some things. I'll be back in about an hour." Mara stood up immediately. "No." "Jonas, I'm coming." Jonas shook his head. "You need to be here with the kids." She pursed her lips. "If Roy is around, it wouldn't be a good idea for you to go out alone." Jonas looked straight at her. "That's why you're in here. If I don't come back soon, you'll have to take care of yourself and the children." Mara was silent, but her eyes showed that she was in great anguish. As Jonas was about to leave, she unconsciously grabbed his sleeve. "Jonas, be careful." He didn't respond with words. He just placed his hand on hers for a very brief second, but it was enough for them both to understand that their concern for each other went beyond mere strangers. Then he turned around. The corner of his dark leather jacket disappeared into the low grass. Jonas headed toward the north woods where the footprints led. Dry bushes bent in the wind. The pines overhead made a rustling sound like the whispers of ancient people. He found more horse prints, hidden among the rocks and rotting leaves, a single print, but deep, indicating that the horse had carried the man with a heavier load than usual. Jonas bent down and touched the indentation. The ground was cold. "A few hours ago," he said to himself. Then suddenly, from the pines in the distance, came the sound of metal clashing. Very faint, but enough to make Jonas stand up straight, gun raised in his hand. He said nothing. He called no one. He was silent the way Western men are silent in the face of danger, his feet planted firmly on the ground. His gun held high at chest level. And he listened. There was the sound of a hoarse breathing. A long, hot breath came from behind the trees. Jonas took a step forward. Then there was another soft sound, the butt of a gun tapping against the saddle. Without looking, Jonas knew who was standing behind that curtain of trees. Roy Dolan. He arrived before Jonas could prepare anything further. Jonas tightened his grip on the gun. His breathing deepened. His heart rate slowed, strangely the sign of someone who had lived too long with danger and knew that avoidance was no longer an option. He did not move forward, nor did he run away. He just stood there, in front of the pine forest, like a rock blocking a raging stream. And from within the forest, a low, drawn-out male voice, as if testing the other party's reaction, rang out, "I know who you are. Hale." Jonas lowered the gun a little, eyes unblinking, and the voice continued, "I came to find my wife." A strong wind swept through, making the pine needles rustle like someone clapping ironically. Jonas Hale, calm as the west, replied in a voice as deep as a rock, "She is not yours anymore." There was no answer, only the sound of a horse pawing the ground, and the breathing of a man coming out of the darkness, closer to Hale Cabin. From the shadows of the pines north of Pine Mesa Ridge, Roy Dolan stepped out. He was not as big as the rumors said, but he had a heavy, wind-shy posture. His dark hair was tangled, his face gaunt, but his eyes were as sharp as shards of glass. A scar across his left cheek made him look like a man who had lived more than one life in the shadows. The black horse behind him stamped its feet on the ground, breathing out a long, cold breath like steel. Jonas Hale remained where he was, shotgun in hand, but lowered. Not threatening, but not yielding either. His calm was a stark contrast to the tension in Roy's eyes. The two men stood about 30 feet apart. The space between them seemed stretched taut by the wind, every fiber quivering. Roy laughed dryly, without any humor. "I've heard of you. Hale, the man who likes to live in a cabin, away from town, as if the world has nothing left for him to worry about." He glanced toward the cabin far behind Jonas. "But it seems now." Jonas showed no expression. His voice was as low as a pebble in a stream. "She and the children are here because they need safety." Roy frowned. "Safe." He laughed again. "She ran away, stole my baby, and you say I leave her alone?" Jonas looked him straight in the eye. She was running from danger, not from family. Roy's face turned a little purple with anger. He took a step toward Jonas, but Jonas did not retreat. "What do you think you know about us?" Roy growled. "How long have you known my wife? 1 night? 2 nights? Do you think she's innocent? I know fear when I see it in someone else's eyes." Jonas replied without thinking. "And that fear is not something people create to deceive anyone." Roy clenched his fists. He stood still for a few seconds, then spoke slowly, without a shout. "You don't know Mara like I do." His eyes were deep and sharp as if sharpened by the wind. "She is my wife. She belongs to me." Jonas paused for a second, not at what Roy said, but at how he said it. The man's use of the word belong set Jonas on fire with an indescribable fire. "Mara belongs to no one," he said, his voice low but sharp as an axe. "She has a choice where she wants to live. You sent her running out into the storm, holding a small child. That is not what a husband does." Roy narrowed his eyes. "He's mine." He gestured toward the cabin, the older one. Evan. I raised him from a baby, and I have the right to take back what's mine." Jonas lowered the gun a little more, but his gaze hardened. "Evan is not an object." Roy sneered. "A man living alone in the woods dares to lecture me about family. You have no wife, no children. What do you know?" Jonas said only one sentence, but it made the wind stand still. "I do, and they die for a man like you." Roy froze for a moment. He blinked, losing the arrogance in his gaze for the first time. Only for a second. But Jonas saw the change. Roy wasn't afraid. But he realized Jonas wasn't the kind of man he could easily intimidate. The wind blew harder, swirling old pine needles around the feet of the two men facing each other. Neither spoke for a few seconds, as if each was considering their next move. Roy took a deep breath, his voice hoarse and low. "I didn't come here to shoot. I just want Mara back. I want Evan back. I'm his father." Jonas looked at Robin with undisguised truth in his eyes. A father does not make his child tremble. Roy grimaced. "You don't know what happened in my house? Then speak." Jonas replied, "I'm listening." There was a long silence. Roy looked down at the ground, his hands clenching and unclenching as if in a struggle. For the first time since Jonas had met him, Roy looked less like a wolf on the hunt, more like a man crushed by his own life. He spoke softly, as if each word were a tear. "Mara. She changed after her mother died. Then, when she got pregnant with Benji, she became distant. She blamed me for things I had no control over." He looked up, his eyes red. "Then one day she left without saying a reason. She took Benji with her. She left Evan to me." Jonas looked at Roy for a few seconds. "She didn't tell me that," he replied. "So what did she tell you?" Roy growled. Jonas spoke slowly, each word clearly that she was treated like an object, that every time she opened her mouth, you told her to shut up, that you grabbed her hand so hard it bruised. He looked straight at Roy, that she ran for her life. Roy stood as if he had been hit with a log. In an instant his face changed completely, no longer fierce, but the bewildered look of someone hearing something he cannot believe. "Mara said that," Roy whispered. "Mara is afraid of that," Jonas corrected. Roy clenched his fists until his skin turned white. He turned his head away, breathing heavily, heavier than a horse's. "Mara was always so quiet," Roy said, as if to his shadow. "She never said anything, never told me. How was I supposed to know? I scared her so much Jonas put the gun down and leaned against his legs. Silence is a cry for help. Roy." The words landed between the two men like an arrow. Roy stood still, his shoulders shaking slightly, not from the cold, but because Jonas's words had touched something he had buried deeper than he cared to admit. Finally, Roy exhaled and said, "I just want to talk to her, just once." He looked at Jonas, his eyes no longer fierce, but confused. "Let me see Mara." Jonas looked toward the distant cabin. He knew that if Roy saw Mara now, the wound in her heart might open like a crack in stone after a rainstorm. But if they didn't let him see them, Roy would become a shadow that would haunt them forever in the pine forest. A wolf deprived of its cubs, never backing down. Jonas closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, his gaze was no longer stormy, but determined. "Okay," he said lowly, "but I'll be there." Roy nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything else," Jonas continued. "No weapons, no threats. I came as a father wanting to see his child, not as a husband wanting to claim ownership." Roy swallowed his pride with difficulty. "Okay." Jonas picked up the gun and placed it on his shoulder. "Follow me," he said. "Let's talk first. Then I'll decide if you should see Mara." Roy nodded, tightened his grip on the reins, and the two turned and headed toward the cabin. In the distance, the small porch of Hale cabin was hidden in the golden grass and green pines. There, Mara and the two children waited. There was the beating heart of Jonas Hale, and he knew the upcoming meeting would be more than just a conversation. It would be a moment that would determine the future of all four people in that small cabin. As they emerged from the pine forest, Jonas Hale led Roy Dolan along a dirt path covered with dead pine needles. Neither spoke as they walked. Each step felt like a decision to be weighed. Jonas walked steadily ahead, Roy a few feet behind, occasionally looking down as if he were carrying a burden greater than his anger. A breeze blew from Red Willow Basin, carrying the scent of damp earth and morning moisture. The road to Hale cabin emerged from the valley. The dark wood roof of the cabin, low and unassuming, lay still as if waiting. When the cabin was only a few dozen feet away, Jonas stopped. He turned to face Roy. "Before you go in," Jonas said softly but firmly, "you must understand one thing." Roy looked at him, his breath coming in short gasps. "What Mara doesn't owe me fear," Jonas said. "Not today. Not ever again." Roy clenched his jaw. "I didn't come here to scare her." Jonas looked deeply into his eyes as if testing the truth of what he said. He said only one sentence, "I will know." Then Jonas walked to the cabin door and knocked twice so Mara would know it was him. Mara was folding a thin blanket near the stove when there was a knock at the door. Benji was playing with small pieces of wood, and Evan was reading an old book Jonas had found for him. Mara looked up, and her first feeling when she heard Jonas's footsteps on the porch was relief. But then, like a shadow descending, she felt another footstep. It was heavy, hurried, so familiar it sent a chill down her spine. She swallowed. Jonas. The door opens. Jonas entered first, but Mara looked right behind him, where Roy Dolan appeared. He stood there, his head bowed slightly, his eyes no longer as fierce as the stormy night, but still dangerous, like a knife not yet drawn from its sheath. Benji saw a stranger and ran to hug his mother's legs. Evan stood up, his heart pounding so hard it showed on his face. Jonas pulled out the nearest chair and placed it in the middle of the room. "Sit down," he said to Roy. Roy paused for a second, then did as he was told. He sat down, but his eyes were still fixed on Mara, as if he were trying to find the woman who had stood in his house quiet, uncompromising, gentle as a blade of grass in the wind. But Mara today is no longer that person. She stood up straight, her hand resting lightly on Benji's shoulder, her voice low but not trembling. "Why are you here?" Roy swallowed, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he didn't know where to start. I just wanted to talk." "What is there to say?" Mara asked, her voice quiet but heavy as stone. "You know I left. You know why?" Roy looked down at his hands. He did not speak immediately. Jonas stood in the corner of the room, his hands on the edge of the fireplace, not joining in the conversation but not taking his eyes off Roy. Jonas was like a human wall. Finally, Roy said, slowly as each word was heavy, "I don't know." He looked at Mara, his eyes strangely confused. "Mara, you never say." Mara took a slow breath, her eyes flashing with the old pain she no longer wanted to hide. "I told you." "Roy, but you didn't listen," Roy stammered. I did everything I thought was right. I raised Evan. I kept the house. I tried to make everyone think we were okay." "You keep your image," Mara said, looking up at him for the first time. "Not your family." Evan stood aside, his face as tense as a grown man's. He was listening to it all, every word, as if listening for the answer to a life torn in two. Roy turned his gaze to Evan. "Son." His voice softened. "I came to take you home." Evan took a half-step back, eyes wide. Mara squeezed her child's hand. Jonas left the corner of the room, stepped closer to the two children, not speaking, but his eyes said, "Let them choose," Mara said, her voice low, each word so clear that Roy had to swallow his words as he was about to continue. Evan is not something to be carried or fought over. He has a right to speak. Roy grimaced. What does a child know? Jonas spoke, his voice as sharp as split wood, fear, pain, and when it doesn't want to go back there, Roy looked at Jonas angrily. You're not his father. Jonas did not get angry. Yes, but I know what it is like to see a child tremble at the sound of a grown-up's footsteps. There was a long, deep, heavy silence that seemed to shrink the cabin. Mara turned to Evan. Is there anything you want to say to your father? Evan looked at his mother, then at Roy. His eyes were like mirrors, reflecting what adults couldn't see in themselves. He swallowed, his voice as soft as the wind through the door. I don't want to go back to that house anymore. Roy jerked his head up, as if he had just been punched in the chest. Evan. The boy continued more clearly this time. I don't want to see Mama cry anymore. I don't want to hear Dad yell. I don't want to see Mama run into the room with Benji and shut the door. Roy's voice cracked. I didn't know. Mara looked at him, for the first time not with fear, but with truth. You never looked closely enough to know. Roy leaned back in his chair, his hands covering his face. He wasn't crying, but his shoulders were shaking slightly, as if his whole body was trying to keep from falling apart. After a long, long while, he said, Mara, I didn't come to pull you back by force. I came because I want to understand. Mara let out a soft breath. I want you to understand, too. Roy looked up, but not to come back to me. Right. She shook her head. No. No anger. No bitterness. Just the truth. Light as a cloth, but cutting as glass. Roy sat still, his hand falling to his lap. The room was so quiet that you could hear the wind pounding against the cabin walls. Jonas looked at Roy for the first time, not with the eyes of a watcher, but with the eyes of someone who knew what it was like to lose family. Roy spoke softly, as if each word was choking him. I will leave. I will let you choose your path. Mara closed her eyes to keep from crying. Evan held her hand tighter. Benji sat on his mother's lap, his face buried in Mara's chest. But Roy did not stand up immediately. He continued. Just one thing. His eyes turned to Evan, no longer fierce or demanding, just a defeated but sincere man. Let me see the child sometimes. Evan looked at his mother. Mara looked at Jonas. Jonas nodded slightly, not giving orders, just trusting Mara to make her own decisions. Mara turned back to Roy. Okay, but safely. For Evan, and for you. Roy bowed his head for so long it seemed as if he were praying. Finally, he said softly, Thank you. Roy stood up, picked up his hat, and turned toward the door. As he walked out, Jonas followed a short distance to make sure Roy left the cabin without anger. Roy turned to Jonas and said very quietly, almost in a confessional tone, Hale, if you can take care of them, do what I couldn't. I will do what is right, Jonas replied. Not for you, for them. Roy nodded. Then he walked down the steps, mounted his horse, and left the valley. No one chased. No one stopped. The wind blew down Dry Creek Road, erasing the footprints. In the cabin. Mara held the children closer. Her hands were shaking, but not with fear, but with something like release. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching the scene silently. There was a quiet warmth in his eyes, the kind of warmth that comes when one knows one has just passed through a door into the past. Mara, Jonas said softly, it's done. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears but her gaze steady as ever. No, Jonas, she said. It's just the beginning. And Jonas understood that in the deepest sense. From here, their lives are no longer about running away, but they begin to learn how to live again. Roy left, leaving Dry Creek Road in a rare calm. Jonas stood on the porch for a long time, watching the retreating figure until even the sound of hooves faded into the pines. He did not return to the cabin immediately. He felt both lighter and heavier, a kind of heaviness that foreshadowed what was to come, but also lighter because the darkest part was behind them. When Jonas entered, Mara was sitting at the table, her hands on the wooden surface as if to steady herself. Benji and Evan stood close to their mother, not saying a word. The air was thick, as if everyone was learning to breathe again after the confrontation. Jonas approached. "He's gone," he said softly. Mara looked up, her eyes still wet but clear. "Thank you, Jonas." Jonas shook his head. "I just stood by. The hardest part is you facing it." A softness passed through Mara's eyes, a softness Jonas had not seen in her since they had met. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have had the courage," she said. Jonas did not answer right away. Mara's words touched a place deep inside him that he had thought had closed after the loss of his wife and child. He went to pour water for the three of them, then rekindled the fire in the stove. The small axe made the room feel more alive after a tense morning. Benji broke the silence first. "Mom, are we staying here?" Mara looked down at her son, stroking his hair. "Yes, at least today." Then she looked at Jonas, as if asking him something she had not dared to say aloud. "As long as you want," Jonas replied. Evan sat down next to Jonas, which surprised Jonas a little. He looked out the door as if he were still hoping to see Roy come back. "Finally," Evan said softly. "Father, will you keep your promise?" Jonas looked straight at the boy, his voice low. "If your father said he would leave, then today he kept his word. So, can I stay here with Mom and Benji?" Jonas put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is a safe place for you. And you have chosen." Evan bowed his head. A tear rolled down his cheek not from fear, but from relief. The child had lived too long in the shadow of a father who never listened. In the days after that meeting, Hale Cabin became a distinctly warm place. Every morning, Jonas took Evan to check the rabbit traps, while Benji tagged along to collect twigs. Mara cleaned up, re-dried the blankets, and fixed bits of junk around the cabin needlework, old gloves, and loose buttons on Jonas's shirt. The small wooden house changed, not noisy but alive, not filled with laughter, but with the scent of people, the scent of peace gradually forming. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink into the pines, Jonas returned from the eastern woods with a large bundle of firewood on his shoulder. He found Mara standing in the small clearing in front of the cabin, gathering fallen logs into 3 neat rows. She worked quietly, with concentration, the way people who have gone through many upheavals try to find order in their lives. Jonas set the bundle of firewood down near her. "Let me do that." Mara shook her head. "It's okay. I'm used to it. I like doing manual labor like this. It makes me calmer." Jonas looked at her hands, thin fingers covered with tiny scratches. "You don't have to do it all alone anymore." Mara smiled slightly. A rare smile Jonas wanted to see more of. "I know." She paused for a second, looking into Jonas's deep, calm eyes. "But I want to help you, too. This cabin, I want it to be ours." Jonas stood still, his heart slowing. He didn't want to believe what he had lost. But Mara's words had a sincerity that reached into the deepest recesses of his mind. "Mara," he said quietly, "if you choose to stay longer, I won't object." She bowed her head slightly, her eyes shining with deep gratitude. I don't know what to choose yet, but at least I know this place doesn't scare me. Jonas took a slow breath. Then stay. One day at a time. The wind picked up a little that afternoon. Evan was chopping small pieces of wood when he was stopped suddenly by a series of strange noises in the distance, wheels grinding on the ground. The sound of hooves. Jonas knew at once that the sound was not Roy's. Roy was alone, and this was coming from a wagon. He motioned the children inside. Mara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the doorknob. A minute later, a small carriage appeared on the dirt road leading into the valley. The driver was a thin old man in a wide-brimmed hat and a red scarf. Jonas recognized him at once. "Samuel Pryor," said Jonas, the old town lawyer of Larkspur Crossing. The carriage stopped in front of the cabin. Samuel stepped out, slightly bent with age. He smiled at Jonas before looking into the cabin. "Jonas Hale, I heard you had a visitor." Jonas frowned. "From whom?" "From the Dust Creek post office." Samuel replied. "Someone sent a letter looking for a woman named Mara Ellery, and they asked the post office to pass it on to me because they know I pass through the area often." Mara heard her name and took a step forward. "Looking for me?" Samuel looked at her, his face gentle and his voice as soft as the old wind. "Yes. A woman from Larkspur Crossing sent a letter looking for you. Said she was your cousin. Her name was Helen Ward." "Right." Mara raised her hand to her mouth and took a half-step back. "Helen? Oh my, I thought she wasn't around anymore." Samuel nodded. "She's still alive. She said she'd heard about you vaguely, but wasn't sure, so she tried to ask around. When I told her she might stop by Red Willow Basin, she asked me to extend an invitation." Mara's breathing quickened, emotions rushing through her. Benji hugged her mother's leg. Evan stood nearby, looking at her worriedly. Samuel took out a small envelope from his pocket. "Mara, you have relatives waiting for you in town." Jonas looked at Mara. Her eyes filled the table with questions. Should she go? Was she ready? Was there a place in the world for her? Jonas spoke slowly, his voice as calm as an anchor holding a ship in a storm. "You can go if you want. I'll take you there and wait outside." Mara said nothing at first. She opened the letter, her hands shaking as she saw the familiar handwriting, soft and round, like the days she sat in the kitchen reading letters with her mother. Helen wrote that she heard Mara had run away from Roy, that she prayed Mara was alive, that she would welcome all three of them, or help with anything Mara needed. Mara folded the letter. She looked at Jonas. "Jonas, I want to go, but I'm scared." "I know," said Jonas, "but you're not going alone." Evan stepped forward, his voice soft but determined. "I'm going with you, Mom." Benji clung to Mara's leg. "Me too." Samuel Pryor smiled. "We can all go. It's not far, only 5.5 miles. Jonas looked at Mara, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw in her eyes not just fear, not just flight, but hope. "Let's go," said Mara. Jonas nodded. "I'll prepare the horse." In that moment, in the fading, golden afternoon, Jonas Hale understood that this trip was not just about finding his loved ones. It was the first step toward Mara truly returning to life, and he was also stepping out of his own darkness. The next morning was so clear that the pines on Pine Mesa Ridge seemed to be brushed by the sun. Hale Cabin emitted a thin wisp of smoke from its stove, a rare sign of morning warmth after days of storm and tension. Jonas Hale prepared 2 horses, his trusty old gray horse named Alder, and a small brown horse named Starling, a gentle horse, suitable for carrying Mara and Benji. Evan was big enough to ride with Jonas, as long as Jonas held the main reins. Mara gathered a few essentials, a water bottle, some leftover cornflakes, the old but clean scarf Jonas had given her last night, and a letter from Helen Ward, a woman she hadn't seen in 8 years. Her fingers trembled as she tied the bag, but her eyes were different, no longer looking down like someone living on fear, but looking ahead like someone starting to believe the future might be bigger than she'd ever thought. Benji was excited about riding. Evan was quiet, but walked with more initiative than usual. Jonas stood near the cabin steps, his gaze sweeping over the three of them. "Let's go," he said softly. Just one sentence, but it sounded more like a guide than an order. The road from Red Willow Basin to Larkspur Crossing stretched about 5.5 miles through open country. Crossing Dry Creek Road and skirting the edge of an old fence, the sky was bright, but the wind still carried the chill of early winter. Sagebrush bushes swayed gently on either side of the road, drawing silvery blue lines in the sunlight. Jonas rode Alder ahead beside Starling, where Mara sat firmly with Benji in her lap. Evan rode alongside Jonas, holding the saddle lightly, watching everything with the familiar wariness of a child raised in a troubled environment. After a while, Mara said softly, "I didn't expect anyone to come looking for me." Jonas looked over, holding the reins tight. "Family is family, Mara. Even if you haven't seen them in years, they still remember. Not everyone is like that," she replied. Jonas was silent. He understood her meaning. Roy had never seen the fear in her eyes, but Helen had heard the cry for help from a distant roomer. Benji jumped up and asked, "Mommy, who is Helen?" Mara stroked her daughter's hair. "She's my cousin, the one who took care of me when my grandparents died. A good person." Evan leaned over to look at his mother and asked softly, "Do you believe her?" Mara thought for a second. "Yes. At least, I want to believe this time." Jonas smiled slightly, not with joy, but with relief at hearing Mara say that. Believing in someone was the first step to healing yourself. Halfway down the road, Jonas stopped beside a slope to examine the tracks. He stood down and looked at the ground. There were old tire marks, but not new. Not from Roy's wagon. No strange horse tracks nearby. Mara looked at him, a little worried. "You think Roy will come back?" Jonas stood up, dusting his hands off. "I don't rule that out." Mara sighed. "I thought things would be a little easier after yesterday's meeting." "They will be easier," said Jonas, "but the road to peace is never straight." Mara felt her heart soften at the words. Jonas was not making any false promises. He was simply saying what life in the West had taught him, things that last take time. The ride was smoother after that. The wind was light, the sky was clear, and the grass and light were a simple, peaceful picture. Jonas watched Mara from the corner of his eye, not to spy, but to make sure she felt safe every minute. He noticed Mara's posture on the horse was more stable than before. Back straight, chin slightly lifted, hands holding the reins with a calmness that had returned. He also noticed that Benji and Evan started talking more to each other, something that hadn't happened the first few days because Evan was confused between loyalty and fear of abandonment. And he realized, for the first time in years, he was on a journey that wasn't his alone. Near Larkspur Crossing, Mara took the initiative to speak up Jonas. "I want to say this before meeting Helen." He turned. "I hear." Mara took a deep breath. "If she asks about me and Roy, I'll tell the truth. I don't want to avoid it anymore." Jonas nodded. "You don't owe anyone a lie. And if she asks me where I want to live," Mara's voice slowed, I don't know how to answer." Jonas looked straight ahead, but his voice was low. "You don't need to decide today. Life is not a trap." Mara bit her lip. "You say that, as if you know very well." Jonas was silent for a moment. Then he replied, "I was stuck in my grief for many years." His hand tightened on the reins. "But I remembered one thing. Home is not where the roof is. It is where you can breathe again." Mara turned to look at him for a long time. Something in her eyes softened and strengthened at the same time. "Jonas, you gave my mother and me breath again." Jonas tilted his head slightly, a little embarrassed that the words had touched a soft spot in him. "You can do that yourself. I only hold the light to show you the way." They reached the edge of Larkspur Crossing as the sun was at its peak. The small town was a patchwork of pale browns and red bricks across the sprawling plain. Low-roofed houses, wooden signs, stables, and clotheslines swayed in the breeze. The townspeople looked at the group curiously, not maliciously, just the small-town thing. Anything strange becomes a big deal. Jonas dismounted first. "We're here. Helen's house is behind the chapel." Mara sat still for a few seconds, taking deep breaths to steady her senses. She got off Starling, her legs shaking slightly, but Jonas stepped forward and gently took her elbow. "It's okay," he said. Evan and Benji walked on either side, like little pillars keeping their mother steady. The four of them walked down the dirt road of the town. The curious glances of the townspeople lessened when they saw Jonas with them. Jonas Hale was a name no one wanted to cause trouble in this area. When she reached the pale green-roofed house at the end of the street, Mara stopped. The house was not large, but there was a trellis on the porch and open windows, light pouring out as if the place had been waiting for someone for a long time. Jonas looked at Mara. "Do you want me to come in?" Mara looked at the house, then back at Jonas. Her face softened as if she were about to face an inescapable part of her past. "Yes. I want you here," she whispered. "At least, until I know I can stand." Jonas nodded. Mara took a deep breath and raised her hand to knock on the door. A hurried sound of footsteps sounded inside. The door opened. A woman in her 40s, wearing a simple cotton dress, her brown hair tied back, stood opposite them. Her eyes were wide with surprise, and bright enough to look like she was about to burst into tears. "Mara," she whispered as if calling someone in a dream. "Goom, Mara, Ellery. For heaven's sake, it's really you." Mara stood still for a second. Then her shoulders shook. Helen stepped forward and hugged her, a hug filled with longing, worry, and the painful joy of seeing a loved one again after so many years of being thought lost. Benji hugged Mara's leg. Evan stood close by. Jonas stood behind, his hand on his hat and his head bowed slightly, a respect for the reunion he knew he didn't quite belong to, but had brought them to. Helen loosened her grip, looking at the two children. "This is—" Benji and Evan. Mara nodded, her eyes red but bright. "Yes, and this is Jonas Hale, the man who saved my mother and me." Helen looked at Jonas, and in her eyes was the deep gratitude of someone who understands that not everyone appears in time to pull a loved one back from the abyss. "Mr. Jonas," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Jonas shook his head slightly. "No need to thank me. I just did what needed to be done." But inside him, something was warming in a way he didn't dare name. Inside the house. Mara told Helen part of what had happened. Not all, but enough for Helen to understand that Mara had been living in Roy Dolan's shadow for longer than she had realized. Helen held Mara's hand. Her eyes filled with love and anger. "You are not alone anymore. As long as you want to stay, there is always a place for you in this house." Mara squeezed her hand. "I am still thinking." Helen nodded. "No one is forcing me. Not here. Not anymore." In that moment, Jonas stood near the window, looking out at the street. He wanted to give Mara some space. It was a family matter. But he stood there, like his instinctive anchor keeping him close enough so that Mara wouldn't feel left out. Helen looked at Jonas and said, "Jonas, thank you for bringing them here. But if you want, you can stay and have lunch with us." Jonas paused. He was not used to being invited to family meals. It had been years since he had eaten in someone else's home, but as Mara looked up at him, eyes still watery but with the light of new faith, he understood that sometimes healing comes from very small things. "I will stay," Jonas said softly. And in that moment, 4 people, a runaway woman, 2 lost children, and a cowboy with a closed heart entered a simple lunch that could become the beginning of something bigger. Something like hope. Something like home. Lunch in Helen Ward's pale green-roofed house was so simple that no one could remember what they had just had. But no one could forget the feeling in that kitchen, the warmth of the old oven, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sunlight streaming through the small window, making golden streaks on the wooden table. For Mara, it was like a memory locked away for years and suddenly opened. For Benji, it was the first time he had ever felt like a home without yelling. For Evan, it was a place where he could sit down without looking around for a place to hide. And for Jonas Hale, it was the first meal in years that he had sat at a table with people around. Helen looked at Jonas and then at Mara, realizing something was forming between the two of them. Something not words, but just enough silence to allow people to belong to each other. After the meal, Helen stood up to pour more water. "Mara, you can stay here as long as you want, but if you want, we can talk about starting over in Larkspur." Mara sat up straight, her hands clasped lightly together. "I know, and thank you." She looked down at the floor, then out the door, where Jonas was standing, letting the 2 children examine the handsaw hanging on the wall like a strange object. "But I'm not sure." Helen put her hand on Mara's shoulder. "No one asked you to decide right away." Mara sighed, a deep breath. "I'm afraid I carry too much brokenness. I'm afraid I don't fit anywhere anymore." Helen did not answer in words. She just hugged Mara again, slowly and deeply, the way Westerners hug to say things that cannot be said in words. In the afternoon, Jonas took the 2 children to the backyard to give Helen and Mara some privacy. The lawn behind the house stretched to a low white fence, where a few chickens roamed. Benji ran after one of the hens, his laughter brightening the space. Evan didn't run after him, but he stood next to Jonas, occasionally glancing at his mother through the window. "Mr. Jonas," Evan asked softly, "will Mom stay here?" Jonas put his hand on the boy's shoulder, as gently as he could. "Maybe. Or maybe your mother wants to go somewhere else, when her heart is ready." Evan bowed his head. "I don't want to leave you." Jonas paused. The small words pierced the heart of the man who thought he was used to being alone. He sat down at Evan's level. "If she chooses to stay with me, I'll make sure you both have a home." He touched the boy's hair lightly. "And if she chooses Larkspur, I'll still be here. Whenever you want to come back, you'll always have a way." Evan looked at Jonas for a long time, as if trying to figure out if what he said was true or just nice things adults say to make children feel better. But in Jonas's quiet eyes, the boy saw something he rarely saw in adults: the truth. Benji ran up, hugged Jonas's leg, and said brightly, "Mr. Jonas." I caught a feather. Jonas laughed softly, a rare laugh that even he found strange. "Well done, boy. A peaceful afternoon. A peace that was made all the more precious by the storm that preceded it." Inside, Mara stood by the window, watching the 3 people in the yard. Jonas stood firm, the 2 children beside him, as if the 3 of them were a peaceful picture of life in the West. Helen stood next to Mara and said softly, "I believe in that man." Mara did not deny it. "I don't know who I can trust anymore. But Jonas, he doesn't say much. He doesn't promise much. But everything he does is so real." Helen smiled. "Sometimes the best people are those who don't know they're good." Then she looked into Mara's eyes. "But you must choose for yourself. Not based on gratitude, not based on fear, only based on your heart." Mara leaned against the wooden window, looking out at the sky that was beginning to turn evening. "I've been running too much. For the first time, I want to stop and see what I really want." Helen nodded. "Then go tell the person who needs to hear it most." Mara turned to Helen, hugging her cousin again. "Thank you." As the sun set over the western pines, Mara stepped out into the backyard. The evening breeze blew gently through the scarf Jonas had given her that morning. She walked slowly toward Jonas, who was showing Evan how to use a small knife to peel a dry branch. Jonas looked up at the sound of footsteps. He knew something important was coming, because there was something new in Mara's eyes, calm determination. "Jonas," she called. Evan understood immediately and stepped back with Benji so they could talk privately. Jonas stood up straight. "Go ahead." Mara took a deep breath, letting her heart speak for her fear. "Helen wants me to stay here, in Larkspur Crossing. She wants to help me start over." She looked back at the small town, then at the dim road leading back to Hale Cabin. "Both places feel safe. But—" Jonas looked straight at her, unprompted. "I don't want to live in fear anymore," Mara said, her voice not shaking as before. "I want to choose a place where I feel like I can breathe, where I feel truly at peace." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "That place is Hale Cabin." Jonas clenched his hands as if to control his emotions. Mara continued, her voice like a small flame in the night. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what will become of us. But I do know. I want to go back to you. I want to rebuild my life, where you are." Jonas took a deep breath, not because it was difficult, but because the words struck a chord in the man who thought he had lost the right to choose again. "Are you sure, Mara?" he said softly. She nodded. "For the first time, I found myself choosing hope, not escape." Jonas took a step closer. He did not touch her, not in a hurry. He just said, "If you choose to return to Hale Cabin, from today on, it will not be just my cabin. It will be our home." Mara's expression softened completely. She did not cry, but a long, soft sigh, like someone setting down luggage after a long journey, escaped her lips. "Then let's go home," Mara said. Evan and Benji heard and ran to hug their mother. Mara hugged them both, then turned to Jonas. His face was as calm as ever, but his eyes were different, warmer, more alive, and with a light that even he didn't know he still possessed. They left town as the sun set, returning to Hale Cabin with Helen standing at the door to see them off, waving as if promising that the little house would always be open when they needed it. On the way back to Red Willow Basin, the sky gradually turned purple. The first stars appeared. The horses walked steadily on the dusty road, the wind carrying the scent of night grass. Benji fell asleep in Mara's lap. Evan rode behind Jonas, leaning against his back as if trusting in his stability. Jonas turned to Mara, who was looking forward with a rare, peaceful look in her eyes. "Mara," he said softly, "thank you for choosing to come back with me." She shook her head slightly. "No, Jonas. I didn't choose for you. I chose for myself." Then she smiled, her eyes meeting his. Light, but deep. "But I know, if I were to start over, I would want to start with you." Jonas looked toward the cabin, which was fading into darkness, a small light coming from the window he had left open before leaving. And he knew, for the first time in years, that light wasn't just there to guide him, it was there to wait, for the people he wanted to call family. Jonas and Mara's story reminds us of something very true. People can endure storms for years, but just one act of kindness can open the way back. Sometimes, fear and hurt make us choose silence, but it is from that silence that we learn to look at ourselves. Healing is not about forgetting the past. It is about finding the person, or place, that makes us feel safe enough to face it. For those in their 60s and older, this story may touch on a memory that has not been opened for a long time: the losses, the times at crossroads, the moments when we had to be strong despite our tired hearts. But it is also age that gives us the most precious gift, the ability to recognize what is worth keeping, and where we truly belong. Thank you for accompanying this story. If you feel warm, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel to continue with me on other healing journeys. Stories for hearts that have gone through many stormy seasons,